This is great. I'm Hindol Sengupta. I'm absolutely thrilled that a fellow scholar has joined me from Singapore. Kathirasan Ji has written this wonderful book, 40 Steps to Liberation. It's really a commentary on the Adi Shankara's Sadhana Pancakam. And he really talks about why, most people watching this program would be familiar with Shankara's name and Shankara's work. But there are a lot of stuff about the Adi Shankaracharya that we still don't know in our modern context. And I think this book does a wonderful job of really taking us through and walking us through to the path of liberation as envisaged by the Adi Shankaracharya. And of course, it not only talks about the Sadhana Panchakam, but it also takes several key verses from the Upanishads. Kathirasan Ji, thanks very much for joining me. Our audience around the world would notice that I'm saying Kathirasan Ji, J-I or G, is Indian honorific. It is used when you want to give a person, additional respect. And he's a scholar from Singapore, works on Hindu philosophy, and I'm delighted he's joined me. Welcome.
Thank you, Hindolji, for the warm welcome and for your kind words. It's a great honor to be here and, of course, to be speaking with a fellow author, commentator, and it's really a pleasure. I look forward to this conversation.
I want to first, at a very basic level, ask you, how did you come? What was your journey, as a modern day person to come to the point where you chose the Sadhana Panchakam? I know in the beginning of your book, you talk about your spiritual master, your guru. You talk about the process and how this particular text was taught to you. Take our audience through the process, and what do you do in the, beyond spirituality, so to speak, beyond Hindu philosophy? Give us a context of your life and your work.
So I will first answer about me probably in a very, very concise manner. Now, I am a professional. I'm an entrepreneur as well. I work in the professional space of leadership development, change management, organizational development, etc. As well as I also lead an organization that deals with mindfulness work in a very secular way. This is primarily my professional life. I've spent more than 20 years in large corporations. My disciplines of training have been engineering, business, etc. And of course, my area of passion has always been the teachings of Advaita. And now that's a segue for me to talk about my spiritual journey. It all started with stumbling on a book called The Life of Ramakrishna. Now, that's where it started for me. And that was a big transformation because it allowed me, in that book, I saw the validity of spirituality in all traditions. I think Paramasa Ramakrishna did a great contribution in allowing people to appreciate that there is divinity in all traditions. That way it started. And then the biggest impact I've had was with the works of Swami Vivekananda. I remember reading his complete works, 8 volumes, as well as the 9th volume. And that really transformed me and impacted me in a very, very huge way. I think it was so impactful that it changed my worldview. And that led me to want to learn Advaita Vedanta in a proper way. And that led me to my teacher, Swami Satprakashananda Saraswati, with whom I learned Shankara Bhashyam and Sanskritam, Sanskrit, and all of that. So that led me to where I am right now. Years later, learning with Swamiji, I started to teach this to people who are also interested. And that led me to want to possibly consider writing. The idea of writing came up not by myself, but one of my friends who suggested, why don't you transcribe your works or write it into books? And that led me to where I am right now. And you are holding the second second commentarial work of mine in that sense. Yeah.
Wonderful. Talk to us a little bit about why this text, why this particular text. There's a lot of Shankara work that you could have chosen, but you chose this particular text, which is in fact, as you also point out in the beginning of the book, is a sort of lesser known text. Why did you choose the Sadhana Panchakam? Why do you think it's important that we should all understand it? How could it be transformative for us?
That's a great question, and I'm going to answer that because I have several reasons for choosing this book. Now, the first thing is as a person in the space of learning and development, I think humans, we learn better when a subject is organized, is natural, right? It's natural for the human mind to look for organization. Even Swami Vivekananda talks about it, generalization and particularization. He talks about that, how we learn through particularization and also generalization. And while there is a virtue in going into a subject matter in a vertical way, going deep, there is also there is also a lot of value in understanding a subject in a broad way, in an organized way. And Sadhana Pancakam is such a text that gives the pedagogy of liberation, the pedagogy to become liberated in a very linear way. This is the beauty, because you don't find this in any other Shankara's text where the path or the means to liberation is presented in a linear way. Though in practice, it's not linear, right? It's in practice, when we meet a teacher, it is not in a linear way that it happens. But though the Vedic tradition presents a very, very structured approach to attaining moksha or liberation, and Shankara presents that linear pedagogy in this text. And therefore, I taught this text to a few people many years ago, and I continue to consider this as one of the, I think, great texts. Now, just because it has a pedagogy doesn't make this a very basic text. I want to mention this. That's why it has perhaps been neglected, or not many commentaries are available, because people think a basic text like this, basic text would mean that it is basic. But I don't subscribe to that. I think that there is so much of life in this text because of the very pedagogy. In fact, after learning, though I learned this from my teacher as one of the first texts, when I look at Shankara's commentaries on his Prasthanatraya, Upanishad, Brahma Sutra, and Bhagavad Gita, when you revisit this text, you see something more, actually, because it is all, each sadhana, each step, it is so crisp that it is, I think it's very pregnant in that sense, that when we look, maybe 10 years later, when I look at this, I would see more, that opportunity is there in this text. And therefore, I felt that this deserves perhaps a very proper commentary. And again, I want to qualify, this commentary is not for a sannyasi, to be honest. I wrote this commentary for the common man. When I use the word common man, I'm talking about grahasthas, householders, perhaps married, with children, with siblings, and maybe brahmacharis who are, living an active life as a professional, busy, going through stress. I wrote this commentary for this particular audience.
I like that you've divided your book into sections which are action-oriented terminology. So let's begin with one of the things I thought was particularly pertinent, because the world that we live in, does not seem to have much of this. You talk about, in one section of your book, you talk about how to attain emotional maturity. Now, emotional maturity, both you and I know, is sadly not very common in our world. I wish we are a world which had more emotional maturity. It's a very interesting choice of words, because the word maturity, I don't think, is usually very common when you're talking about philosophical texts. I want you to delve in a little bit about why you chose these words, and what does the Sadhana Panchakam, according to you, tell us or teach us that helps us attain emotional maturity, because that's something we can apply directly in our lives today.
Right. Absolutely. Great question, Hindolji. I'm so glad that you asked this question, because the reader may have realized that actually I've spent quite a bit of energy presenting this emotional maturity from the standpoint of bhava samshuddhi. That's a context that I gave from the tradition to present this. And why did I do that? Now, this came out to me because of one particular reason that I've noticed, which is whenever a sadhaka, an aspirant, studies a Vedanta text, I see that I continue to acknowledge and see that there comes about a cognitive dissonance in the person's life. And what happens is this. Let me give you, give this maybe perhaps through a scenario. Now, I'm going to this Vedanta class, and the guru is teaching me and telling me that the Atma is Brahman, the self is Brahman. Wow, beautiful, is nice. And then I go home, and the next thing, I start an argument with my spouse. And then my son comes to me and says, hey, father, dad, I need to do this homework. And I tell him, go away, I'm busy with work. Now look at that. This is what I mean by dissonance. Now, why does this happen? Now, this happens because the knowledge of the Shastra or the Vedanta text has not been used to create value within a particular context. Now, this context through which we negotiate and process the knowledge is actually where the sadhana happens to me, in my perspective. Because if I am going to be filled with anger, filled with jealousy, filled with all of these emotions, which are yet to mature, a mature emotion would mean that I'm able to approach this with samatva, keeping perhaps values like satyam and ahimsa, truth and non-injury, as foundations. Now, when that doesn't happen, what happens is I tend to compartmentalize my living. I think that going to Vedanta class is one self, and the self that leaves the Vedanta class and comes home or goes to work is another self. I'm not integrating these two selves into one self. So therefore, the topic on emotional maturity is very critical, because that's where I say the rubber meets the road. That's when the rubber meets the road. I learn all of this, wow, beautiful, nice. And then I go back home, I'm a different self. So, and the challenge is a lot of Vedanta texts do not address this. Now, there's a reason for this, because traditionally Vedanta was meant for the sannyasi, the renunciate, not for the common man, technically. So therefore, I think it is the burden and the responsibility of the teacher to bring life, to breathe life into this particular contextual need. Does that answer that question, Hindolji?
This is particularly important, Kathirasan ji, because I often find in my audiences, whenever I give talks on my books and so on and so forth, and I'm sure you find this too, a lot of people ask, how do we bring, okay, it's wonderful that Adi Shankaracharya said this, or Ramanuja said this, Madhavacharya said this, or more modern figures, Vivekananda said this, Srila Prabhupada said this. Great, wonderful. How do we bring all these principles and apply to our lives today in the imperfect, crazy, really conflicted lives we all lead? How do we apply them today in our lives so that our lives today can become better? Because it's only so much helpful for me to hear that, say, Vivekananda said this, 200 years ago, or the Adi Shankaracharya said this 1,000 years ago, if it doesn't do anything to alleviate the problems I have in my life today. So what you said is really, really important. You also talk about in your book about building something you call sannyasi buddhi, which in English would probably translate into a sort of intellect of the monastic intellect, or the intellect of a monk, right? Talk to us a little about that idea. I found that idea particularly interesting too.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So you see, the whole idea of sannyasa buddhi, which is basically the appreciation and the way that you look at life through the attitude of sannyasa, meaning renunciation. Now, this means that the person who the aspirant or the sadhaka is actually a sannyasi. That's the traditional position, or the norm through which people learn Shastra, Vedanta especially. But today, like people like you and I, we are not sannyasis. And to be honest, a lot of times when I teach this text, none of them in the group, none of them in the audience is sannyasi. I believe the same for you. You don't see sannyasis in your audience, but yet they are the ones who are consuming and reading these books.
Quite
And
right.
even when I go, yeah, exactly. When I go to a Ramakrishna mission in Singapore, and when I go for their prayers or their, when they observe particular days or festivals, and I see, besides the people who are managing the mutt or the mission, I don't see anyone who's a sannyasi, right? So there, but however, we know that the Vedanta texts expect that the eligible or the competent seeker to be a sannyasi, a renunciate. What does that mean then? So I need to now create a context, right, which is sanctioned by Shastra, which is very important. It cannot be my opinion, to be honest, that allows people to see this as an attitude. You see now. So sannyasa buddhi here is an analysis and a presentation of what are the attitudes that make a sannyasi a sannyasi. And how can a person like a grahastha, householder, or a person who is an active person living life in the society, how can they bring these attitudes and cultivate it consciously. So therefore, sannyasa buddhi it's relevant for the sannyasi and the non-sannyasi. Because as long as I want to know the self, I want to know Brahman, I want to be, liberated, then I need to cultivate this attitude of sannyasa, renunciation, which the Gita, Bhagavad Gita, beautifully presents as karma yoga. And the whole idea of what I call sense of samatva or equanimity towards life experiences becomes sannyasa from the standpoint of the Gita. And the Bhagavad Gita beautifully presents that. And that's how I've taken that perspective when presenting this particular section in the book in the form of sannyasa buddhi, where someone, regardless of not being a sannyasi, can also cultivate this attitude and therefore consciously make oneself fit to assimilate the knowledge of the Vedanta texts.
That's fascinating. One of the things I wanted to ask you in a very prosaic sort of way, because your book says 40 steps to liberation. So what are these 40 steps? You can, I won't ask you to, go through all 40 steps, but broadly in your understanding, what are these 40 steps and how can we practice them so that, all of us really move towards a higher consciousness, towards liberation?
So these 40 steps can be organized into 3 stages. Now, the first stage, it is called pravritti dharma, which is in we translate that it means a life of activity or a life of acquisition, which is the first stage of any human being's life. Even a child, if you were to see, instinctively it want to grasp an object, put it in his mouth. This particular tendency to want to acquire things is actually instinctive in us. But how can we do it ethically? Here comes the dharma, where ethically we live our lives through particular kinds of activities like prayer, like rituals, observing the duties meant for a particular stage of life, or the rules that the duties that have been bestowed on me through my family traditions, etc. So I observe that. That's the first stage. The second stage after pravritti dharma is called karma yoga. Now, karma yoga is a very conscious pursuit of preparing oneself to take a direct approach or a direct means to knowing the self. So this is a stage of preparation, very conscious preparation, in my opinion. So in this stage of conscious preparation, my sadhanas evolve. There is a lot of what I call shifting from not only rituals, but doing the rituals in a very conscious and in a transformed way. That's what the Bhagavad Gita comes, which presents 2 important aspects of karma yoga, which is arpana buddhi, offering actions to Ishvara through duty, through actions. And then the second one is receiving the results with equanimity. 2 things that are cultivated in order for us to prepare the mind now, prepare oneself to make ourselves competent. That's the second stage. The third and final stage is a direct pursuit of knowledge through which we know Brahman, which is sometimes called Brahma Jignasa or sometimes called Jnana Yoga, or the yoga of knowledge. So the final stage is where this text spent a lot of actually energy. In fact, only the first 2 sadhanas pertain to pravritti dharma, the first stage. Now, the next 9 sadhanas pertain to karma yoga. The rest of them are all jnana yoga. So you can see that this text has been written by Shankara in a way that where he presumes that the person who is reading this has already evaluated dharma and practiced dharma, the first stage, and now coming into perhaps the second stage, where he spends a little more time. But most of his energy is in the last stage, the final stage of jnana yoga, where from sadhana 12 onwards till 40, it's all jnana. It's all about knowledge, direct pursuit of knowledge. And interestingly, the teacher, people always say this. I believe you have heard this. Someone says, I want to attain moksha or liberation. Someone would tell me maybe, you need to find a guru, right? That's the usual response, right? Because this knowledge cannot be, assimilated effectively without the guidance of a teacher. Interestingly, the seeking of a teacher happens to be the 13th sadhana. Can you imagine that? So if it is a 13th sadhana, 1 to 12 are all for preparation. So what I'm trying to share is that we spend less time paying attention to the preparation, and somehow we spend more time looking for a guru. Instead, what we should do is spend more time in preparation, and that will automatically lead one to the teacher. That's why someone will say, you don't look for the teacher would appear. The teacher would appear when someone is prepared. So preparation is where the effort should be before looking for a teacher in that sense. So to summarize, the 40 sadhanas can be, organized into 3 stages. And you can see from sadhana 12 onwards is all jnana yoga, which means that we have 28 sadhanas entirely on jnana yoga, which shows the importance and the emphasis that the text that Shankara actually makes with regard to why jnana is the direct means, knowledge, the direct means to liberation.
As we come to the end of this conversation, I have one last question for you, Kathirasan ji, which is really in the theme of how we had this conversation. One of the key parts of your book talks about a dharmic lifestyle. Now, I like the combination of the word dharma with the word lifestyle, right? Because lifestyle in most people's mind is about, the car I buy, the phone I buy, the Netflix show I like, all kinds of things, right? Now, many people talk about dharma in such a way that it's sort of, it's almost like an out-of-body experience. You need to go away from whatever you're doing to sort of attain dharma, right? But I really like the confluence of these two ideas, because really perhaps the best practice of dharma is if you can imbibe the dharmic principles in whatever you do, no matter how small or no matter how big. And I want to request you to, focus on that at the last part of your answer, on how you think, in your opinion, in your practice, and indeed in writing this wonderful book, and everybody should read it, 40 Steps to Liberation, a commentary on Adi Sankara's Sadhana Pancakam and key verses of principal Upanishads by Kathirasan K, who lives in Singapore and has written this great book. Focus on that, how to imbibe these two ideas in everyday living.
Thank you for that. I think it's a very, very important question. It's actually an enquiry. Actually, everyone should undertake this enquiry, because this deals with the way we see dharma. Sometimes we tend to, like when I was way younger, I used to think dharma means, once a day I go to the puja altar, I do my prayer. That's my dharma. It ends. Everything outside that altar does not require me to conform to any kind of ethics or any kind of what I call duty consciousness. Now, that kind of living actually creates more suffering, because we have compartmentalized and segregated dharma to be a religious activity. However, if you look at it from the ancient tradition of Sanatana Dharma, dharma is not presented as an exclusive activity. It is a 24/7 affair. From the time I wake up till the time I go to bed, dharma is. It happens in that present moment where I'm awake, where I'm conscious. So every thought, every action, every word that I utter can actually be filled and be inspired by dharma. That is the life that reduces suffering. And a lot of time people ask, why am I suffering? I would usually say one of the reasons, not the only reason, one of the reasons is because we think dharma is an exclusive affair that is out, like what you said, out of body experience, or something that I reserve in the altar or in the temple or when I'm meditating. No, it's a 24/7 affair. If I'm more aware of my word, thought, and deed, and how it aligns to dharma as it has been taught in the text, in the Vedic text, then I would see that actually there is a congruence. When there is congruence, I feel at ease, and that ease itself allows me to even handle the most difficult challenges in my life. So it has to creep into everything. From the time I start brushing my teeth and to the time I set my alarm before I go to bed, every moment is dharma. Until I get there, I would suffer. Maybe you would say you are very comfortable, and you don't see that suffering. Maybe, yes, that could be your karma. I would not deny it. But that doesn't take away the fact that when I don't observe this, I may suffer, people around me may suffer, and in the future, I may suffer. I cannot, because no one can guarantee, no one can predict the future. So, but if I want to be happy, sukha, suffering here, means dukkha, which can mean be dissatisfaction, it can be unhappiness, any form of, any form of negative emotions. If I want more positive emotions, then definitely I need to see that this congruence is very much needed. I need to observe this as a 24/7 pursuit in the present time, all the time, every word, every thought, every deed. If I start being congruent, whether I like it or not, that sense of ease, that sense of comfort, that this itself, this alignment, as I call the alignment with the universal order, right? Sometimes called Rita in the Veda. This alignment with the universal order itself confers a certain degree of sukha. Now, that is a great incentive for anyone. Not only do I benefit, but when I align, the whole world benefits, which what the Gita says, loka sangraha. And that's the value of dharma, the way I see it, Hindolji.
On that wonderful note, really heartwarming and wonderful note, may we all be able to practice dharma, as you said, from the moment you wake up and brush your teeth to the last moment of your day when you set the alarm and go to sleep. May we be able to practice dharma, which benefits not only us but the entire universe. Thank you very much, Kathirasan Ji, for your time and for all the wisdom that you've shared with us. Once again, wonderful book. Congratulations. 40 Steps to Liberation. Thanks very much for your time, and thank you for writing a wonderful book.
Thank you, Hindolji, for having me. I really appreciate the time that I spent having this conversation with you. It's a really an honor and pleasure to be speaking with you.